Hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of CFO 4.0. Today, we have the authors of Winning with Data Science. They're going to talk to us all about the power of good decision making using data. And the authors we have with us today are Howard Friedman and Akshay Swaminathan. So, welcome, Akshay. Thank you for joining us on the show, and welcome, Howard, as well.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Brilliant. So to just tell us a little bit about your backgrounds, guys. So Akshay, what's your background? How did you get into talking and writing a book on data science?
So my background is in machine learning and statistics. And actually before that, my real background is in global health. So I did a lot of global health work in Bolivia where, we led a nonprofit that worked with indigenous communities down there. And we worked with them to set up a primary care clinic. And that experience was the first time that I started thinking about population level determinants of health. The communities we worked with, there was no running water, no Wi-Fi, limited access to healthcare. Whereas just a half an hour drive away in the city center, we're enjoying hot showers and high-speed internet. And so that whole experience got me thinking about population level determinants of health, and that's when I started getting into the field of statistics and data to understand trends in populations. And so that led me to work at Flatiron Health using data to inform FDA decision making for cancer treatments. And then after that, I led the data science team at Cerebral, where we used data to improve the delivery of mental health care. We've helped over 700,000 patients all across the country, and throughout this entire journey I've had, Howard and I, both of us, we've been struck by not only the importance of doing good data science, but the importance of the people we work with as data scientists, right? These are the clinicians, these are the domain experts, the stakeholders, the business collaborators who often make or break the success of data science projects. And that was really the motivation for writing the book, as I'm sure Howard will tell you more about.
And Howard, what about you? What's your background, and how did you both meet as well? Because I haven't asked that question yet.
And so I'll tell you a little bit about my background. Akshay left off the fact that he's doing his MD PhD at Stanford right now. So there's a really cool part of his bio I wanted to make sure we don't miss. So for myself, I always loved data analysis, and I was one of those kids who was looking at the back of baseball cards, trying to figure out which one is going to make it into the Hall of Fame, because that would be a really good baseball card to collect. I did a master's in statistics, PhD in engineering, and then I ran data modeling teams at Capital One, which is a bank, for a number of years, and then started doing more in healthcare. And I worked with a lot of pharmaceutical companies, health insurance companies, as well as private equity firms who are working either in finance, in health, or other areas. And so I've worked in a lot of those spaces. I've also worked in the private sector. I'm based in New York, so in addition to some of that work, I also teach at Columbia University. And Akshay and I met while he was doing an internship many, many years ago, and we just really hit it off.
And how long has this book been in the making, out of interest? Has it been something you guys have talked about for a while, or did it just happen all of a sudden?
Well, books don't happen all of a sudden, but I would say it was a very quickly written book. When you write a nonfiction book, you typically have to write sample chapters and then do a proposal. So we had to go through that process, and that took a long time. But I think from once we got the green light to writing the rest of the book, it was less than a year. I think it was quite quick. And Akshay is a phenomenal collaborator for writing. I've written books by myself. I've collaborated on research papers, and I have to say, this book was a lot easier to write than any other book I had written before. And I think it was really just the strength of his collaboration.
Hey, that's a definite tick in the box for yourself, Akshay, in terms of you can write good collaborator on the CV moving forwards. So when we're talking about data and decisions, right? So obviously we're talking here to a lot of CFOs that are day-to-day are either taking responsibility for data within their organizations or driving analytics programs internally. So what are some of the things that they should be considering when it comes to how to make good decisions based on data? What are some of the things they should be looking out for? I guess, Akshay, we'll start with you.
Sure. So the first thing I would say is, do you have data that you can use to make these decisions? Now, every business has data, but the question is, are you collecting that data? Is it in a format that's readily accessible to analyze? And these are the first steps in becoming, what I sometimes call a level one data-driven organization, right? That level one means collecting the data, setting up the mechanisms to collect the data, whether it's from your customers, your clients, or even internal data processing. And then the second part of that is storing that data in a way that it's accessible to your internal team. Now that could be, maybe you already have an internal data science team or a data team, data analytics team. You have a database set up, or maybe you just have data that's sitting in spreadsheets or Google Sheets. So that's really the first step, and then from there it's a matter of processing that data and making sure you have the right internal talent to help you extract the insights from that data, right? So if you're a larger company, do you have a data team? Do you have someone with expertise in analytics, in data science and database management, so that working with if you're a CFO, right, working with the HR team to make sure that they're recruiting the right talent to set your business up for these processes. I'd say that's the first step.
So I've worked with Fortune 100 companies, but with small companies as well, where couldn't agree more with Akshay. Data is the question number one, but often they have a little bit of their own data and they're bringing in some third-party data as well. And then for the analysis, they don't have a data science team in-house. They're looking to either bring in a consultant or have a tool that allows them to get ready insights as well as solve problems without investing too much in programming. And so, again, it depends on the context, but if you have a large company, usually you've got more human resources and financial resources. With smaller companies, they have to be a little bit more scrappy, and they're looking for solutions which are more user-friendly with a lower bar for utilization.
And how do we ensure that the data that we're working with is of a good quality enough to use for decisions? Because you can obviously only make good decisions if the data that you're working with is telling you the correct thing. So how do you assess the quality of the data? What sort of things should you be looking out for? Maybe, Howard, you could start us off.
So happy to talk about it, and then of course love having Akshay jump in and supplement more. Data quality is absolutely critical. You've heard the phrase "garbage in, garbage out." It's true. Yet at the same time, we have to start with something. So when we start looking at data sets, we start looking at basic things, range checks. Are these in the ranges that we expect them to be? The distribution of missing and non-missing. So what is the level of completeness of the data set? Also starting to look at what I call known facts. So are there relationships that should exist between different features? Are they there? Are they not there? So those give us a layer of confidence in our information. If we have a high degree of missing, then I have to worry about, well, is it missing at random or not? If I have complete data, I can put that aside. On my range checks, if everyone is in a reasonable age range, that's great. If I have people who are 238 years old, that's a problem. And I need to dig into, why do I have these unusual data points? By the way, those unusual data points happen all the time. So we have to dig into those. And then lastly, I like to look at the known facts. So when I have continuous variables, just getting those correlations up, just quickly to look at it and say, how does this agree with what I know is true about the real world? And this is where getting the business customers, the CFOs, or their team involved, because they know the known facts. If you just corner the data world off and leave it with the data scientists, that's a problem. They might create wonderful solutions for problems that don't exist, and they may not be able to ground it in the information you need. And that's something that we bring up in our book. And I should mention the book is told a narrative approach. It's fictitious characters, and they're working through one a consumer finance company, the other one is a health insurance company. But they're providing the business knowledge, those real world facts, to help assess not only data quality, but also Does the model serve its purpose? And even start addressing some of those ethical issues.
Yeah, those are all great points by Howard. I would say, as a CFO, I'm always thinking what we talk about in the book is what are the key questions that you can ask, right? We actually end each chapter with a set of questions that you can take into your next meeting. So, as a CFO or a business leader, what are the questions you can ask to get at data quality? I think the highest yield one is, where does this data come from? Right? What is the data source? And I'll give you a quick example. Let's say you're running a restaurant business and your data team comes to you and says, hey, in the last month, our customer satisfaction scores were 2.5 out of 5 stars, right? Now, you can just take that data and run with it and make whatever decision you want, or you can pause and ask the question, where does that data come from, right? What is the data source? And so then maybe they tell you, oh, this is from our Yelp page. Okay. Then you ask, okay, how many reviews do we have? They say, oh, we got 4 reviews. Okay, so now all of a sudden you have a much better picture of what that 2.5 out of 5 actually means. Right? This is coming from 4 customers who posted on Yelp. Now imagine they came to you and so then you can say, okay, this is not a high quality data source, right? And then you start a survey collection program where after as the server is giving each customer their check, they asked them to fill out a quick out of 5 stars review. Then the next month your data team comes back to you and they say, hey, our customer satisfaction scores are 4.5 out of 5 stars, right? How many data points do we have? Oh, we have 1,000 data points because now we're sampling every single customer as they're getting their check. And so that's just a quick example of how asking that question can give you a much better gauge of how much confidence to put in a given data point, and then can also give you ideas for better data collection.
And you talk there about sources, and we've heard a lot about AI recently about sort of embedded bias. Is bias an issue with data as well as with some of the other tools that we're working with?
Certainly, yeah. I can maybe speak to that first, and Howard, please jump in. So, people think AI is, our savior. AI will solve all our problems, but AI, as Howard said, garbage in, garbage out. Right? AI is only as good as the data that it's trained on, and a lot of these cutting edge AI models are trained on, very simply put, the internet. Right? And what do we know about the internet? It is the most raw data out there. Right? It's really good at a lot of things. It's really good at capturing patterns in how humans speak, how natural language. But there are a lot of things that the internet is not the best place for, like high quality medical advice, for example. Right? And so we need to be really cognizant. We need to not get caught by this fallacy that AI. We look at papers that say, oh, this performance of this AI system is 98% accurate. We need to always ask that question, right? Where does the data come from? What is the data source? And there are more and more papers now talking about the importance of curating high quality training data sets for AI models. And that's why if you're running a company that has a lot of data, that data is your biggest asset. And one way you can actually leverage that data is by curating it, in a way that you can develop your own AI models, because no one out there is going to be able to develop an AI model with your data. You're the only person who has your data. And so if you can find a way to curate that and then use that to train AI systems, that is in some cases could be a golden ticket.
And we talk about obviously curating and developing our data sets. What sort of biases might there be, within our data sets? What sort of things should we be looking out for?
So when we start talking about internal data sets, of course, we have all of the selection biases associated with who is engaging with your company. So, and these are not random samples. Selection bias is a very dominant form of bias. In addition, you have all the other biases that are related to the processes, which then are layered on top of it. So if certain customers, for example, are directed towards one product versus another because of the offerings, well, then we might see a trend in sales in one direction or another. So there is this question of how to readjust for those. But when I think of bias, I'm more concerned about AI perpetuating damaging biases, such as when you see racial biases that are embedded in the training data, and then the AI makes recommendations or continues to propagate those biases. Those are the types of biases that I get concerned about. So whether it's sexual biases, gender biases, and we can see this happening. And so again, the data is an important issue. I was at a very interesting roundtable session not too long ago around AI, and it's interesting how the conversation deteriorated quickly into the deification of AI. Either it's going to save everyone or it's going to destroy the world. And I don't think either will happen. I don't think it's one or the other. But I do think that if we don't provide curated high quality data, we will create a greater problems for ourselves. And by the way, this isn't just my own opinion. If you look at some of the deals that are happening these days, some of the larger private companies that are investing heavily in LLMs are paying content providers now because they want high quality data. They don't want to be training off low quality, large volume data. They realize that there's a difference.
And we talked about obviously the different skill sets that sit within large and small companies earlier. Is like how are able are smaller organizations to understand and detect those biases? Whether we're using it for AI tools or just decision making purposes, that it's the same challenge. So, what can we do as small business owners to actually address this as a challenge?
Well, I would say if you're a small business owner, don't fall into the AI trap, right? The AI hype trap, right? A lot of businesses right now, big and small, are asking the question, how can we use AI? Right? I actually think that's the wrong question. Right? You need to be starting with, what are my most pressing business problems? Right? If you start with how can I use AI, you're going to end up finding a lot of applications for AI that are totally worthless and do not add value to your business. So, my first thing would say, if you're a small business, I would ask, do you really need AI, right? What are the problems that you have? And is AI really the best solution? We have actually not seen that many. I'm in the healthcare field, right? We have yet to see hard quantitative results that show that using AI within clinical workflows, hospital workflows, generates substantial ROI for health systems. We have yet to see that. And so I think that is the first thing to get get on the same page about. This, if you are a data first company, right? There are a lot of startups now that are data first, AI first. Even if you're a small company, you can do a lot if you have a small, devoted, data team whose sole role it is to set up those data pipelines to ingest the data from the raw sources, right? Whether it's clients or vendors or wherever, route that into a centralized data lake, data warehouse, and then add on top of that a business intelligence layer, so you can make that data accessible to anyone in the business. This is what we did at Cerebral with tremendous success, where instead of having the data team be the bottleneck in generating insights, the data team's job was to act as almost a steward or a internal vendor for data. And we just provide these interfaces for anyone in the business, non-technical users, to interact with the data via a business intelligence tool. And so that model can be extremely successful because now all of a sudden you've expanded the pool of users that can play with the data. And when you have more people playing with the data, you have more people generating insights. Some of the most important, valuable insights we generated came from people on our, non-technical teams, the business teams, the product teams, who are just playing around, creating their own dashboards, creating their own tables and visualizations.
I'm going to say I'm slightly more optimistic about what has been delivered so far. Different work experiences, and first part of my bias is I do some work related to finance, and in finance, they often have a lot more money than other sectors, and that allows them to invest more in technology and more in human resources. And in finance, I have seen some very good applications of AI which have generated true savings, and that the ROI of the actual product, from the cost of producing it to the implementation, were quite positive. Again, that's in one area and in a large company. In small companies, I've seen one good example of workflow processing in healthcare, which has shown true value in AI application, and the value was in automating discharge notes from hospital systems. And basically, at that point, the discharge physician just has to review the notes, and it summarizes everything the patient had as well as the instructions going forward post discharge. That's been a good success. But I've seen a lot of failures too. So I would say I'm slightly more optimistic, but I've seen a lot of failures. And I think the main reason why I've seen a lot of failures is too often, and again, putting on that CFO hat, I see too many companies who are starting with, I need an AI strategy versus what are my most critical problems I need to solve? And then let's talk to the technical specialists around what are the best tools to solve the problem. So starting with the problem, looking for a solution rather than starting with what is, the cool topic everyone's talking about, and let's find some problems. To me, that's the mistake.
And I work in tech, guys, and I couldn't agree with you more. I think AI, like anything, has become one of those buzzwords that just everyone feels like they have to talk about it or use it in some way. And actually, like you say, as CFOs and as business owners, you need to allocate your resources in the right way. And if AI is a tool that can solve that problem, amazing. But I also think we need to think about the maturity of AI. It is still very cutting, if not bleeding edge, as a technology. And I think there's a lot of work for it to become sort of as mainstream as we need it to be to see those applications at all levels.
You had a beautiful phrase there, which is bleeding edge. And for the groups that I work with, I usually ask them very much at the beginning, do you want to be at the bleeding edge, the leading edge, or do you want to be a laggard in terms of technology? And just have that dialogue. And I have almost never heard someone say, I want to be at the bleeding edge, taking all the pain so later other companies can learn from my mistakes. I don't hear that as an answer usually.
No, absolutely. And I think it's happened so fast, isn't it? That's it's become, and even
Incredible.
now when we're talking about data, we are still talking about it. So let's go back onto the important subject today, which is all about data. And let's just talk a bit about some of the dangers of what, making decisions based on data. We talked about the fact that sometimes we can interpret data in different ways. And I've seen this in action. So I thought it was an interesting topic to bring up. So, when we're seeing patterns and we're seeing things in our data, how can we make sure we're drawing the right conclusions from that? And what sort of questions should we be asking ourselves to make sure that we're not making assumptions around the outcomes? So, any thoughts on that? I'm not sure who wants to take the first leap, but I'll leave it up to you guys.
I want to start, and it's mostly a setup for Akshay because this is one of the chapters that he wrote. He has a brilliant chapter in the book, which is specifically in the healthcare space, looking at it, and it's this dialogue between the data analytics teams, the data science teams, and this wonderful leader of a health insurance company as she's guiding them as they're first about to misinterpret and then talking about basically confounding variables. What are the other factors that need to be considered? So my shameless plug would be one, of course, not only data quality, but really understanding what are the other confounding factors that could be driving this result. What are we not considering? Having an open dialogue. But I would love to kind of pass that over to Akshay, and you wrote that chapter, so you know the example I'm talking about in the book, if you don't mind.
Yeah, no, for sure. So I think the first step is what question are you interested in, right? It's not usually very fruitful to go digging for insights without a clear question to begin with, right? And so the chapter in the book that Howard's referring to, the question that they were trying to answer is which patients are responsible for the highest healthcare costs, right? And that led to a need to figure out. It turned into a more specific thing where if someone has back pain, right, should they get spine surgery or should they get a non-surgical treatment option, right? So that's a very specific question. Once you have a specific question, it becomes much easier to figure out how to answer that question. Once you've defined your question, right, you want to figure out what is the right analytic approach. And so there are a couple of different types of questions that I think it's useful for business people to understand. So one of the big messages we have in the book is, as business leaders interfacing with data scientists, you have to learn some basic terminology. Because if you learn this terminology, it makes the conversation easier, and it makes sure that you're on the same page with the technical team. So learn the difference between a predictive analysis, a descriptive analysis, right? Those are usually the two most common analyses that we see in in industry, right? So exploratory descriptive analysis is basically understanding large trends. A predictive question is more like, can we predict this outcome, right? And so in the chapter example is, can we predict basically whether someone should have gotten a spine surgery or a non-surgical option, and specifically we're trying to predict. And so basically the dialogue in the chapter is all about, okay, how do we set up this problem, right? What is the thing that we're actually trying to predict? What should the outcome be for this model? And so when you're designing these analyses, there's so many questions that come up, right? What is the inclusion criteria of the cohort? Who are we going to apply this model to? How do we define the predictor variables? How do we define the outcome variables? And this is really where the domain experts should be interfacing with the data science teams. If you leave it to the data science teams, they might pick variables that don't make much clinical sense at all. And so in this dialogue, the data science team suggests an outcome variable, and then Kamala, who's this, MD MBA, she has a clinical background, is starting to get into the data science space. She's able to interject and push back and say, hey, that outcome actually doesn't make much sense. And so they had this back and forth, eventually converging on some decisions that, while not perfect, because no decision is, no model is perfect, right? It's something that, both sides are reasonably satisfied with. And so I think it's very illustrative to see that dialogue play out, because that's how it happens in the real world.
And you mentioned two pieces of terminology, obviously predictive and descriptive. And you mentioned the term outcome variable. Can you just explain that to us?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, let's use some examples here, and let's go back to my, restaurant business example. So, descriptive analysis. Here are some questions for which you might use a descriptive analysis. What is the demographic of our customers, right? What are our most popular and least popular dishes? What are the most and least popular types or times during the year and times during the day, during the week, when we see the biggest client volume, right? These are all questions that can be answered using descriptive statistics, or it's simple tables, simple graphs. Predictive, right? For example, can we predict what type of what dish someone will order based on their demographics, based on their, based on the time that they come in, based on, the size of their party, right? So that is that's a more predictive question, right? Can we predict what someone's going to order? So those are those terms. Outcome variable is basically the thing that you are, predicting. So let's make this more concrete. Can we predict whether someone is going to buy, more than $10 worth of food or less than $10 worth of food, right? That might be an important question for the business to answer. And so, that is your outcome variable. It's basically a binary outcome. Are they paying more than $10 or less than $10? And then based on that, you can maybe you can design ad campaigns, right, based on different demographics, et cetera. So, that's just a quick example to answer that question.
And drawing it right back to the CFO target audience, one of the things that CFOs are very concerned about is developing forecasts of future sales volumes, forecasts of future human resource needs, forecasts for the other drivers of profitability. So those forecasts, those are predictive models, and ideally they're models which drive off of predictions of factors that are lagged, right? In your ideal world, my model is using information in the past so I can have that going forward. But what happens in the real world is as a CFO, you start doing your forecast, pretty soon you're having to forecast not just that projection of sales, but also the inputs, those features that drive that forecast. And that's when the uncertainty in your prediction really starts taking off. So, I've done a lot of that work. I actually ran Capital One's loss forecasting team for a couple of years. And so we always felt the challenge of forecasting when we had to have our features forecast and then use those. And we also loved it when we were in this short term period where everything was lagged information and we were extremely accurate in our short term forecasts.
And you're 100% right, Howard. Like, a lot of CFOs are genuinely trying to build consistency in their forecasting, which is always a challenge. Does data science have an answer for us on this? Or what are some of the things we could be thinking about to help improve the predictability of what we're working with?
Well, I certainly think it does. And again, I've been doing this in that forecasting space for a few decades now. There was a time when people relied on time series with one or two regressors. Those regressors are other features that they could use for the modeling. But we've gotten much more advanced. There's some really wonderful machine learning time series forecasting models and methods that can be used. There's software as well as there's open source that can be used. And the real question, though, is not just do I get a set of numbers, but should I be confident in those numbers? How do I assess whether these are reasonable or not? And so we've gotten better at methods as well. So data partitioning, which is a very transparent concept when I'm trying to predict, for example, what someone is going to order for tonight's dinner, becomes a bit more complicated when it's a time series. You have to slice your data into different back tests. So it's a little more counterintuitive, but we have methods for that. And overall, our techniques are a lot stronger and our data visualization is a lot better. So when someone wants to understand what's the relationship between a feature and my outcome variable, let's say it's profitability or let's say it's revenue, I can show that information using, for example, a partial dependence plot. This type of visualization is really helpful for the CFO or someone else to understand what's driving those forecasts. That type of technology, that type of insight, we're much better at now than we used to be. And hopefully we'll continue to get better and better at that.
Yeah. On the other side of the spectrum, just real quick, I know there are a lot of companies out there that are still relying on Excel models for their forecasting. And it might be a huge lift to transition to a more sophisticated system. But I would say even if you're relying on Excel models, there's still important things that you can do to improve the robustness of your estimates. Like, number one, check your assumptions, right? Use data to check your assumptions, right? I'm sure you have assumptions baked in for LTV, for customer acquisition costs, and how these things are changing over time, net revenue, whatnot. You're also tracking that data, I presume. So a very simple exercise that can be very high yield is just use the real world data that you've collected to check your hypotheses in your model and update the model accordingly. And it's a very simple thing that I've worked with some companies to do, and it's often very revealing. Either you'll find that, hey, your model is actually pretty good, or you'll find that, hey, our assumptions are off, and we need to readjust. So either way, it's an insightful analysis.
Absolutely. And I think anything that we can do to improve accuracy, because I think one of the biggest challenges right now is that there are so many variables impacting the way we forecast. So if I'm not sure how many people had a forecast for COVID, for a mass pandemic hitting their financials. But the ability to respond quickly to that change and be able to reforecast, I think it is incredibly important. So we've talked a lot about obviously going in with good questions, right? What's your perspective on using data to find things you didn't even think to ask about? So to actually find patterns and trends perhaps you haven't considered. Is that something you're seeing that people see value in, or do you genuinely believe that we should always have a question that we're going to data with?
Please, I'd like Akshay first because I do a lot more data dredging, I think, than he does.
Yeah. My gut reaction is it reminds me kind of a full body MRI scan. There's some companies that are offering this now as a preventative health tool, and what health experts say is that if you do a full body MRI scan, you're going to find something, right? Everyone is going to have incidental findings, and following up on every one of those incidental findings can often, be more expensive. One, and two, can actually cause harm. Biopsies have some risk associated with them, right? And so I think the same concept applies to data, right? If you go digging around in data, you're going to find something. You're going to find something interesting, and to follow up on all those interesting, findings is going to take time and resources. And so, if you're an organization that has unlimited resources and you already have people doing the more hypothesis driven and question driven approach, and then in parallel want to have a blue sky exploration of your data to find new moonshot ideas or new avenues of exploration, I think that can be productive. I think looking at the data for insights, more open exploration can be good for hypothesis generation and for generating product ideas. But to solve pressing business problems, it needs to be hypothesis driven.
So I think Akshay put it very well. I would have to say, and I was kind of joking, but not totally joking, that I do a bit more data dredging than he does. And that's because I'm often challenged with building as good of a model as possible, often with really not as much requirement for explainability. The explainability I aim for is, of course, what are the most important features, that those partial dependence plots. But if I can identify through feature engineering or a new data source something that's strongly predictive, people are happy in general. And that said, when I'm looking kind of more at the exploratory stage, not at doing my predictive modeling, I'm a big fan of things like Bonferroni corrections. And for those who aren't familiar with this, it's basically the idea that if you're doing a series of tests over time, then, and this is more in the statistical world, then that notion of a p-value threshold, whether it was 0.05 or 0.01, needs to be brought down much lower to reflect the fact that you're testing lots and lots of things. So when I do this in the health space, I'm very careful to say, if I'm talking about probabilities and p-values, I also want to have a conversation about how many tests did I run and how we have to adjust those criteria. Again, that's less in the data science and implementing models and more in the classical statistics, but I frame that in all my conversations with my clients to tell them, listen, if I'm going to test 100 variables to see if any of them are predictive, some of them are going to be. So let's be honest about what really the threshold is and what we need this for.
And I think you talk in the book about causality and correlation. So, and about how you can understand patterns and trends, but perhaps you need to be a little bit careful about what assumptions you make based on what you see. So could you talk us through what you see as like almost like best practice for looking at the reasons behind patterns and trends, and some ways to avoid some of the common mistakes that people make with data?
Well, I'm going to start, if you don't mind, Akshay, with just a couple of quick thoughts, and would love your additions on it. For me, I do believe that people should start with an understanding of the data first. And whether it's the 80-20 rule or some other way to look at your data, I'm a big believer in do the descriptive statistics first. Try to understand what is in your data set. What are the basic relationships you're seeing through correlations? Look at univariate relationships. Do they make sense directionally before you start opening up the door to a machine learning model or some other advanced regression model? I find too often people want to jump immediately into the modeling, and that's when problems happen. Right now I'm working with a group who they followed my advice. They did the correlation matrices. They see some factors that look like they're strongly predictive. They built a regression, and suddenly the coefficients are the reverse direction. And they paused and they said, let's talk about what happened here. And I love that they paused, because that gives us the opportunity to say, are these highly correlated? Do we have an omitted variable bias going on? Is this necessary? How impactful is it? So it gives the opportunity to think about it. Whereas often I see many companies just jumping through with a black box, taking the best solution and not asking the question of, did the directionality make sense? Is there something else going on I should think about? But those are my first thoughts. Akshay, I know you were going to dive in with some ideas as well.
No, yeah. I mean, when it comes to when we talk about causation, right? We're asking the question: Does X cause Y? And this can be, for example, in I'll go back to the restaurant example, our running example for today. Let's say a restaurant runs a new ad campaign or they run a new sale. To really test, did this sale cause improve increased revenue, or did this marketing campaign lead to increased number of clients? You need to do an experiment, right? You need to have a control group and you need to have an experimental group, right? And ideally that needs to be a random allocation. So maybe you design it in a way such that 3 of your locations in city A get this promo, and 3 of your locations in city B don't get the promo, and then you switch it, and so that's the first step. But oftentimes the data can't tell you why, right? Data can help you answer the what questions, the who questions, the when, where, but to get at the why, it's often way quicker and easier to just talk to the humans, right? Talk to your clients, do a focus group, set up some interviews. So I think as data scientists, we also need to be a little bit humble and recognize that oftentimes, the quickest, route to getting an answer is go the qualitative route, right? Have a conversation with someone, take some notes, figure out, okay, why didn't you like this ad? Okay, what didn't you like about this dish? Was it too spicy? Was the texture not right? Like, you're not going to get that no matter how many models you build. So I think it's important to recognize, when data is not always the best tool for the problem that we're interested in.
And that's coming from a data scientist, which is really is a great way to think about it. And I really love the approach that both of you taken about practicality, because I think sometimes, like other things, you can get wrapped up in the power of data without thinking about, should I actually be using and applying it in this context and with this question.
But that's also somewhat in the book itself, because the book is focused on dialogue. It's a narrative approach on purpose. It's meant to stimulate from the customer point of view, whether that's the CFO or someone working for the CFO's team, for them to think about what questions they should ask the data science team. And conversely, we see a lot of data scientists really enjoying the book because it's giving them an idea of what the customer should be wondering about, what they should prepare for. And so really that softer skill, that conversation, that linking is critically important. And that's something that is really a basis of winning with data science.
So I'm very aware that, and I promise I won't keep asking you questions the entire afternoon or evening. But just to sum up, for our listeners, if they want to make good decisions, and have a genuinely robust approach to database decision making, what are your top tips for starting down that route? And I'm going to start with one, which is read the book. Right. But apart from that, what top tips would you give to our listeners?
Well, reading the book is a great idea. Buying 100 copies of the book and distributing to your friends is an even better idea.
Absolutely.
But once we get past that, the 3 themes that I think are really coming across clearly in the book is learning the language. So understand just some of the basic concepts. It doesn't mean you need to become a data scientist, but as you brought up in our dialogue, understand what is a feature, what is supervised machine learning, what does cross-validation mean. So know some of the knowledge, the verbs, understand how to challenge assumptions, and ask good questions. And what is a good question? We give examples in the book, but it's always around why. Why did you choose this? Why are you assuming this? Those are really the focus. So language, challenging assumptions, asking good questions. Akshay?
I think you summed it up better than I could have. So don't have too much to add there. I think those 3 things it's all about how can we get the business folks, right, the non-technical people, to leverage their domain expertise, their specialized knowledge that the data team doesn't have, right? How can we get these 2 parties to come together more effectively? And to do those things, you got to do exactly what Howard said, right? Learn the language, ask the right questions, challenge assumptions.
Amazing. Well, thank you both for joining me on the podcast today. If anyone wants to learn more about either of you, find the book, where is the best place to get hold of it?
If you want to learn more about the book and about us, you can go to winningwithdatascience.com.
Amazing. And I'm assuming the book is available on all of the main bookstores as well. So for us Amazon geeks amongst the listeners, is it available in ebook and in hard copy?
Yes, it is.
Fabulous. So for all of our listeners, thank you so much. And genuinely, I have actually, having had read a copy, I would have a look at some really interesting information that I think finance teams need to understand. And I will say that it's a very easy read. So thank you to both Akshay and Howard for writing it. It helps you understand some of the terminology in a practical sense. So if you want to obviously have a look at those links, I'll put the links in the show notes as usual. And a big thank you to Howard and Akshay for joining me on the podcast today.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for having us.
And to all of my listeners, if you've enjoyed this episode, perhaps there's some good, key questions I've missed, and that you think I should ask on the next time. Should I be able to convince the guys to come back on? Then please do reach out. If you've enjoyed this episode, please leave a review, and I'll see you next time on the CFO 4.0 podcast.